The distant groan of ancient engines rolls through the smoke. Welcome, my friends. Draw a little closer and listen while the embers of an old war still glow beneath forgotten mountains where silence often hides greater danger than the roar of battle. Some worlds vanish into history without ceremony, yet their deepest secrets can change the fate of countless lives. Walk carefully now, keep your eyes upon the fading light, and let the story begin. The Battle of Endor had ended months before, yet the fires it kindled still burned across the galaxy. News of the Emperor's death had traveled faster than any fleet, but belief did not always follow truth, and on countless distant worlds, Imperial officers clung to old orders as though the voice of their master might still echo through a crackling hollow projector. Some garrisons surrendered without a fight, some declared themselves independent warlords, and others prepared to drag entire populations into ruin rather than yield. Far from the crowded core worlds, beyond the trade lanes where victory celebrations had long since faded into routine, one forgotten industrial planet continued to breathe smoke into a gray sky, as if nothing had changed. It had been built to feed war. In every furnace, rail line, and refinery still remembered its purpose. The world was called Vondaris, a place of black mountains carved open by generations of mining machines and rivers that reflected copper instead of blue. Gigantic assembly halls stretched for kilometers beneath armored roofs, while towering chimneys stained the clouds with ash that drifted like dirty snow across abandoned loading yards. Once, transport ships had arrived every hour to carry armored vehicle parts, reactor housings, and starship components to Imperial shipyards throughout the galaxy. Now only a handful of freighters came and went under heavy escort, their captains avoiding unnecessary questions and never lingering longer than required. Even in silence, the factories groaned, their aging machinery coughing and rumbling like enormous beasts refusing to die. Few citizens knew the true extent of the underground complex hidden beneath those factories. Beneath layers of production floors and cargo tunnels lay reservoirs of volatile hyperfuel, enough to sustain years of military campaigns across entire sectors. Engineers had designed the vaults with impossible care, surrounding them with blast doors thicker than the hulls of cruisers and cooling systems that never stopped circulating. Should those safeguards ever fail, the explosion would not merely erase a city, it would split mountains, poison the atmosphere, and leave Vondaris a lifeless scar visible from orbit. Only a handful of Imperial officers still possessed clearance codes to reach those depths, and one of them had already made his decision. Colonel Garrick Voss stood before the reinforced viewport of Fortress Aurek, watching another column of smoke climb into the evening sky. His uniform remained immaculate despite the grime surrounding the fortress, each rank plaque polished with almost obsessive precision, while his gray hair framed a face weathered more by discipline than by age. The officer behind him waited silently, datapad clasped against his chest, unwilling to interrupt until spoken to. At last, Voss broke the silence without turning around. "Any word from Coruscant?" he asked, though his voice carried little expectation. "No confirmation, sir," the younger officer answered quietly. "Only rumors. The New Republic claims control over more systems every week." Voss closed his eyes for a heartbeat before speaking again. "Claims are wind," he said. Orders are stone. The words sounded rehearsed, as though he had repeated them to himself every morning since the Battle of Endor. Deep within him lived a truth he refused to acknowledge aloud. He no longer expected rescue from an Imperial fleet, nor did he believe the Emperor would somehow return. Yet surrender felt more unbearable than death, because it demanded admitting that every sacrifice, every campaign, and every command had ended in failure. Pride became armor, and armor could imprison the one wearing it. Across the sector, aboard the New Republic corvette Vigilant Dawn, Captain Terran Vall studied a rotating hologram of Vondaris while stars drifted beyond the bridge viewport. The vessel was modest compared to the cruisers that now formed the backbone of the growing Republic fleet, but it excelled at reconnaissance and rapid deployment into dangerous territory. Around the tactical display stood a small team chosen not for overwhelming firepower, but for adaptability, each member carrying experience gathered during years of rebellion. Their mission appeared simple on paper: verify Imperial activity, determine whether the industrial world could be liberated without devastating casualties, and report before committing larger forces. None of them believed simplicity survived first contact with the Empire. Commander Lyra Sen folded her arms as the hologram expanded to reveal subterranean levels beneath the factories. "These scans are incomplete," she observed, tracing a glowing tunnel that vanished into blank space. Either the archives were corrupted during the war, or someone erased the lower sections deliberately. Beside her, Sergeant Bren Casto gave a humorless grin while checking the charge pack of his blaster rifle. "Whenever someone hides a basement that carefully," he muttered, "it's never full of harmless storage crates." Captain Vale nodded without smiling. He had learned long ago that jokes spoken before missions often concealed instincts people could not explain. The final member of the briefing remained silent until Vale looked directly at him. His name was Corin Malik, once an Imperial engineer responsible for maintenance systems throughout the Vondaris complex before deserting 2 years earlier after witnessing civilian labor camps expand beyond anything military necessity could justify. He was older than most rebels, his dark hair already threaded with silver, and his hands still carried faint burn scars earned from decades spent around reactors and molten alloys. The hologram illuminated his face with shifting blue light as memories returned uninvited. "Those maps aren't incomplete," he said at last. "They're sanitized. The Empire never allowed full architectural records outside the governor's office." Every pair of eyes settled on Corin as he stepped closer to the projection. He reached toward one section hidden beneath the central refinery and drew invisible lines through empty space from memory alone. "There are maintenance passages here, and beneath this cooling shaft," he explained, his voice steady despite the weight of old recollections. "Officially, they don't exist. We built them so repair crews could reach fuel regulators during emergencies, but intelligence classified the network afterward." Lyra studied him carefully before asking the question lingering in everyone's thoughts. "Can those passages still get us inside?" Corin hesitated just long enough for uncertainty to become visible before answering. "If they haven't collapsed, yes." Captain Vale dismissed the briefing and invited only Corin to remain behind. Once the others had departed, the bridge became quieter, filled only with the distant hum of engines and muted conversations from duty stations. Vale rested both hands against the tactical table. "You don't have to go down there," he said. "Your knowledge has already given us more than command expected." Corrin looked through the viewport toward the stars where Vondaris waited beyond hyperspace. "I helped build the place," he replied softly. "If it's become a weapon against its own people, then part of that burden belongs to me." Val considered the older man for several long moments before speaking again. "Intelligence intercepted fragmented transmissions before we left Chandrila," he said. "Something about fuel transfers and emergency lockdown procedures. They couldn't decrypt everything." Corrin's expression tightened with immediate recognition, not because he understood the message completely, but because certain words carried meanings invisible to outsiders. Emergency lockdowns were never activated merely to defend a refinery. They existed to isolate catastrophic failures before they spread through the underground reservoirs. A chill settled over him that no starship climate controls could explain. The Corvette entered hyperspace before dawn shipboard time, its engines releasing the familiar surge that stretched starlight into luminous rivers. Crew members settled into routines practiced across countless operations, checking equipment, reviewing contingency plans, and pretending the mission ahead would unfold according to careful preparation. Corrin sat alone in a quiet compartment, turning a small Durasteel identification badge over in his scarred hands. The engraved Imperial cog had been scratched nearly beyond recognition years earlier, yet he had never thrown it away because forgetting was easier than understanding. Outside the hull, the galaxy blurred into impossible light, while inside his thoughts wandered through corridors he had hoped never to walk again. Far ahead, beneath Vondaris's endless ceiling of smoke, warning sirens echoed through forgotten levels where few living souls ever ventured. Massive blast doors unlocked with grinding reluctance, revealing tunnels lined by coolant pipes wider than starfighter fuselages and reservoirs that glowed with an uneasy amber light beneath armored transparasteel. Colonel Voss descended alone except for two silent security droids whose photoreceptors swept across every shadow. He reached an ancient command console sealed behind multiple authentication locks and rested his hand upon its cold metal surface. After a long silence, he entered the first authorization code, and somewhere deep beneath the planet, machinery that had slept for decades slowly awakened. The vigilant dawn emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Vondaris system beneath the pale light of a swollen orange star. Immediately, the bridge came alive with restrained urgency as sensor operators compared fresh readings against intelligence gathered weeks earlier, discovering subtle differences that unsettled even the most experienced among them. 3 Imperial patrol craft circled the planet in irregular patterns instead of disciplined formations, their routes constantly shifting as though they expected an attack but no longer trusted one another enough to coordinate properly. Captain Taryn Vale watched the display without speaking, noticing gaps large enough for a careful approach, yet dangerous enough to suggest deliberate bait. Beyond the patrols drifted an aging Gozanti transport and 2 battered customs corvettes that should have been retired years before. A reminder that whatever forces remained loyal to the Empire here were surviving on determination rather than abundant resources. They've been cut off for months, Commander Lyra Sen observed quietly. A desperate garrison can become more dangerous than a confident one. Vol gave a slight nod, knowing desperation often ignored calculations that sane commanders respected. The corvette slipped behind the shadow of the system's outermost moon, reducing its emissions while the crew prepared a shuttle for atmospheric insertion. Sergeant Bren Casto inspected each crate personally, checking explosives, spare power cells, climbing gear, and compact field scanners with the same care he once devoted to maintaining stolen rebel equipment on hidden jungle bases. A young technician secured the final cargo net and hesitated before stepping back. "Sir," she asked cautiously, "if things go wrong down there, how long before the fleet can reach you?" Bren looked toward the closed ramp for a moment before answering. "Long enough that we'd better not count on them." The technician managed a nervous smile, though neither of them found much comfort in the exchange, and Bren climbed aboard, carrying more responsibility than supplies. Corin Malik paused before entering the shuttle, feeling the familiar scent of machine oil drifting from the cargo compartment. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else, yet it reached across years with startling force. He remembered standing in spotless Imperial shipyards, wearing a fresh engineer's uniform, believing efficiency and order could improve the galaxy, despite the harshness surrounding them. Those memories had once carried pride, but now they tasted like metal, left too long in the mouth. Commander Sen stepped beside him without interrupting his thoughts. "Still time to stay aboard," she said, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. Corin shook his head slowly. "No," he answered. "If I turn away now, those tunnels will never stop following me." Far below, life continued across Vondaris with uneasy routine because ordinary citizens rarely possessed the luxury of believing history had changed overnight. Workers crossed elevated walkways, suspended between soot-covered buildings, while freight haulers rolled along cracked ferrocrete roads, carrying ore from distant mines that never truly closed. Children hurried through narrow residential districts, wrapped in scarves against the ash that settled almost every afternoon, chasing one another between rows of rusting moisture collectors whose best years had passed decades earlier. They knew little about galactic politics beyond whispered conversations overheard from weary parents. What mattered was whether food shipments arrived on time, whether power remained stable through the night, and whether another round of military inspections disrupted an already difficult existence. The Empire's banners still hung above government offices, faded by smoke and weather, but even those symbols seemed tired beneath the endless gray sky. In the administrative quarter, Governor Enrique Solvan stood inside his office reading reports that refused to agree with one another. Official production figures claimed the factories continued operating at acceptable capacity, yet freight manifests showed fewer shipments leaving orbit every month, while fuel consumption inexplicably increased. He had served the Empire faithfully for nearly 15 years, though unlike Colonel Voss, he possessed little taste for glorious last stands or empty declarations of loyalty. Solvan preferred stability because stability preserved both industry and his own position. When his communications officer entered carrying another encrypted transmission from Fortress Aurek, the governor accepted it with visible reluctance. The message contained only a brief notice informing civilian authorities that several districts would soon be evacuated for strategic security operations. No explanation accompanied the order, and that silence frightened him far more than any detailed military directive could have. The shuttle pierced Vondaris's cloud layers under reduced power, buffeted by turbulent winds carrying ash and microscopic particles of industrial residue. Rain streaked across the cockpit canopy, though the droplets left rusty trails instead of clear water, and lightning flickered within dense smoke banks that never seemed entirely natural. Their pilot guided the craft through a winding descent between mountain ridges, scarred by generations of excavation, until towering refinery stacks emerged from the haze like colossal stone pillars. "Landing zone in 2 minutes," she reported, adjusting the controls with practiced precision. The valley below appeared abandoned except for a forgotten ore processing station whose collapsed roof concealed the entrance Corrin had identified from memory. If Imperial surveillance still overlooked the location, fortune had granted them a narrow opening. If not, the mission might end before anyone placed a boot on the ground. The shuttle settled onto broken duracrete with barely more sound than the wind already carried through the empty facility. The team disembarked quickly, unloading equipment before the pilot lifted away again to rendezvous with the vigilant dawn in orbit. Silence returned almost immediately, interrupted only by the distant groan of machinery echoing across the valley, and the steady hiss of steam escaping fractured pipes. Corrin studied the surrounding cliffs, recognizing landmarks hidden beneath years of neglect. "The maintenance entrance should be below that conveyor structure," he said, pointing toward a rusted framework leaning at an uneasy angle. Bren moved ahead with scanner raised while Lyra covered the rear, each step leaving shallow prints in ash that had accumulated like snow across the abandoned yard. Every instinct warned them they were being watched, though neither scanners nor eyes found evidence of another living soul. They reached the conveyor only to discover that its support columns had partially collapsed, burying the maintenance hatch beneath twisted beams and slabs of hardened concrete. Bren crouched beside the obstruction, brushing away layers of soot until dull gray durasteel emerged beneath his gloves. "The hatch is intact," he muttered, examining the locking mechanism. "The bad news is that 3 tons of wreckage are sitting on top of it." Corrin walked slowly around the pile, searching for details others would naturally overlook. His gaze settled on a narrow maintenance conduit disappearing beneath fractured piping. "Not 3 tons," he corrected. "Most of the weight is resting against the conveyor frame. Remove the wrong beam and the whole thing comes down. Remove the right one and the pressure shifts away from the hatch." Lyra studied the unstable structure overhead and sighed softly. "Then let's be very careful about choosing the right one." While the team worked in the abandoned valley, Colonel Garrick Voss stood once again within the underground command vault, surrounded by humming machinery, older than many starships still serving across the galaxy. Ancient status displays awakened one after another, projecting streams of amber symbols that confirmed dormant systems were returning to operational readiness exactly as their designers intended. The senior technician accompanying him swallowed nervously after reading the first diagnostics. "Colonel," he began carefully, The ignition lattice is reconnecting to the primary reservoirs. If we continue, reversing the process will become increasingly difficult. Voss kept his attention fixed upon the glowing console. It was never meant to be reversible, he replied. It was meant to deny victory to those who destroy the Empire. The technician lowered his eyes, recognizing that further objections would accomplish nothing except attracting dangerous attention. Governor Sullivan could no longer ignore the unease creeping through every report crossing his desk. Against military protocol, he requested an immediate audience with Colonel Voss, expecting at least a delayed response acknowledging receipt. Instead, his transmission returned unopened with priority restrictions that even a planetary governor lacked authority to bypass. That refusal unsettled him more than outright hostility would have. He summoned his closest civilian advisors and ordered them to begin discreet preparations for emergency evacuations without alarming the public, though none of them understood exactly what disaster they were preparing to escape. One advisor hesitated before asking the obvious question. "Governor, if the military objects?" Sullivan looked toward the smoke beyond his office window. "Then we move before they notice," he answered, surprising even himself with the firmness of his own voice. After nearly an hour of careful labor, the final support beam shifted exactly as Corrin predicted, allowing the collapsed structure to settle with a deep metallic groan instead of catastrophic collapse. Dust rolled through the air in thick clouds while Bren forced open the maintenance hatch using a portable hydraulic spreader. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the unmistakable scent of coolant, old wiring, and sealed corridors untouched by sunlight for many years. Corrin stared into the darkness below, every remembered detail returning with painful clarity. He knew where the passage led, which junctions would still function, and where emergency bulkheads might trap the unwary. More troubling was the realization that if he remembered all this after 2 years away, others still loyal to the Empire would remember it as well. Without another word, he descended the ladder first, disappearing into the shadows as the hatch slowly closed above them. The hatch sealed overhead with a dull metallic thud that echoed down the shaft until silence reclaimed the darkness. Only the narrow beams of their helmet lamps pierced the black, sweeping across walls lined with faded maintenance markings and conduits wrapped in aging insulation. The air felt noticeably cooler than the surface, heavy with the scent of lubricants, ozone, and mineral-rich moisture that condensed into slow droplets along the ceiling. Water struck the grated walkway below in an irregular rhythm. Each impact magnified through the enclosed passage until it sounded like distant footsteps approaching from unseen corridors. Corrin rested one hand against the rail, allowing memory to guide him before his eyes fully adjusted. "Stay close," he murmured without turning. These tunnels were never designed to be easy for strangers. The maintenance corridor descended gradually through the mountain beneath the factory complex, weaving around coolant reservoirs and power conduits that continued humming despite years of neglect. Emergency lights still glowed at intervals, their pale amber illumination flickering weakly as aging capacitors struggled to hold a charge. Bren studied the walls while keeping his rifle ready, noticing maintenance stencils half hidden beneath grime and rust. "Everything still has power," he whispered. "Someone's maintaining this place?" Corrin nodded slowly. "Not someone. Hundreds once. These systems feed the entire underground network. If they fail, the fuel vaults become unstable within days. Lyra absorbed every word, beginning to understand that this mission was entering terrain where engineering mattered as much as blaster fire. After nearly 20 minutes of careful progress, they reached the first junction where 4 tunnels branched away into different sectors beneath the mountain. Corin stopped beside an old schematic mounted inside a cracked transparasteel frame and brushed away years of accumulated dust. Much of the map had faded beyond recognition, but enough remained to confirm what memory already told him. He pointed toward the western passage. That leads beneath the assembly halls. His fingers shifted toward another corridor, disappearing into darkness. This one reaches the refinery levels, though several sections were flooded even before I left. Finally, he indicated the narrow tunnel descending steeply ahead. The command infrastructure lies below that route. If Voss is activating anything dangerous, he'll be somewhere beyond it. Lyra knelt beside the junction and unpacked a compact sensor unit no larger than a field ration case. She extended its antenna, waiting while the device searched for movement through layers of reinforced durasteel and rock that weakened every signal it received. Static crackled softly before several faint returns appeared across the display. Most remained distant and stationary, likely machinery or automated equipment continuing ancient routines. One cluster, however, moved steadily through lower levels in disciplined formation. Bren leaned over her shoulder. "Troopers?" he asked. Lyra adjusted the sensitivity before answering. "Either stormtroopers or security droids. Too organized to be maintenance crews." Corin frowned as he studied the same readings. "Then they're already expecting trouble." Far above them, Fortress Aurek had become noticeably busier since dawn. Stormtroopers marched between fortified checkpoints carrying ammunition crates instead of routine supplies, while technicians hurried through communication centers attempting to restore increasingly unreliable long-range transmitters. Many had spent weeks sending encrypted messages toward Imperial sectors that never answered, yet protocol demanded they continue. In the central operations room, Colonel Voss reviewed updated security reports without displaying the slightest concern over his shrinking resources. An aide approached carrying a data pad filled with maintenance alerts from the lower complex. "Pressure fluctuations in several coolant loops," she reported. "Engineering recommends immediate inspection." Voss accepted the report but barely glanced at it. "Approve whatever personnel they require," he replied. "Nothing below the mountain must fail before I give the order." Governor Sullivan spent that same morning traveling through residential districts without his formal escort, choosing an unmarked ground vehicle instead of an official convoy. He wanted to see the city with his own eyes before deciding whether his growing fears had substance. Everywhere he looked, he found signs of quiet exhaustion rather than rebellion. Shopkeepers rationed dwindling inventories, while families queued patiently for food deliveries arriving later with each passing week. Factory whistles still summoned workers at scheduled hours, but fewer transports departed the loading yards than official records claimed. When Sullivan stopped beside an elderly woman struggling to lift a container of recycled water, she thanked him without recognizing the governor standing before her. Her gratitude settled heavily upon him because he knew these people had no idea how close they might already be to catastrophe. Deep beneath the surface, Corin led the team into a vast service gallery where enormous coolant pipes crossed overhead like the roots of ancient trees. Steam drifted lazily from relief valves, turning their flashlight beams into shimmering columns of pale gold that dissolved into darkness above. The scale of the chamber silenced even Bren for a moment. Every few seconds, a powerful vibration passed through the metal floor as pumps somewhere beyond the walls forced thousands of liters of coolant toward unseen reactors. Corin slowed, studying a massive valve assembly positioned beside the walkway. He reached out almost instinctively, running scarred fingers across the cold metal housing. "I supervised the installation of this regulator," he said quietly. "It took 6 months because Command refused to delay production, even when safety inspections failed." His voice carried no pride, only regret that had deepened with time instead of fading. Lyra noticed the expression crossing his face and chose her next question carefully. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" she asked while the others continued scanning the chamber. Corin remained silent for several steps before answering. "At first, I believed the Empire could be repaired from within. Then I convinced myself I was protecting civilians by preventing accidents. By the time I accepted the truth, too many people had already suffered because I stayed." Bren glanced back without judgment. He had met enough former Imperials to know that everyone crossed the line between duty and conscience at different moments. Some never crossed it at all. Without warning, the sensor clipped to Lyra's belt, emitted a sharp pulse that echoed through the gallery. She silenced it instantly, but the damage had already been done. Somewhere beyond the maze of pipes came the unmistakable sound of armored boots striking steel walkways in rapid succession. White beams of searchlights swept across distant platforms before vanishing behind support columns. Bren lowered himself behind a coolant manifold, raising 2 fingers to signal approaching hostiles. Corin extinguished his lamp while Lyra motioned everyone into deeper shadow. The patrol was still several corridors away, yet in the enclosed tunnels, every careless sound traveled farther than expected. 4 stormtroopers entered the gallery moments later, accompanied by a black KX series security droid whose heavy footsteps carried a deeper metallic resonance than the soldiers surrounding it. Their armor appeared worn from constant use, marked by scratches and repairs that spoke of a garrison cut off from regular supply lines. The droid paused midway across the chamber, rotating its photoreceptors slowly across the darkness. "Thermal variance detected," it announced in a flat mechanical voice. One of the troopers sighed impatiently. "It's the pipes again," he replied. "Everything down here leaks heat." The droid processed the explanation for several seconds before continuing forward, though its sensors lingered toward the shadows where the New Republic team remained perfectly still. Corin scarcely breathed as the patrol passed within 20 meters of their position. He recognized the route immediately. Those soldiers were not conducting random security sweeps. They were reinforcing access to the deeper command sectors, exactly where he had intended to lead the team. Once the echoes of their footsteps faded, Bren released a slow breath through clenched teeth. "Next time," he whispered, "I'd prefer enemies that don't bring military-grade scanners." Lyra remained focused on the sensor display. "That wasn't routine security," she said. "They've doubled patrol density around the lower vaults. Something important is happening sooner than we thought." Colonel Voss received confirmation less than an hour later that every ignition subsystem had completed preliminary synchronization. The chief technician stood rigidly beside the command console, reading diagnostics that inspired little confidence despite their technical success. "Colonel," he said cautiously, "once the final sequence begins, reservoir temperatures will continue climbing whether or not we retain external power. Even destroying this control room won't stop the process." Voss regarded the enormous holographic projection of the underground complex glowing before him. Thousands of tiny lights marked reactors, cooling stations, pressure gates, and fuel chambers extending for kilometers beneath the mountains. "That is precisely why the Emperor approved the design," he answered. "No enemy should ever inherit what was built for his empire." Several levels below the command vault, unnoticed by either side, another figure moved through forgotten maintenance passages, carrying neither military equipment nor Republic insignia. Wrapped in a stained worker's coat and guiding a battered utility cart through dimly lit corridors, the elderly technician seemed little different from countless laborers who had spent decades servicing machinery beneath Vondaris. Yet concealed beneath spare tools lay encrypted data cylinders copied from restricted engineering archives over many years of quiet observation. He paused beside an abandoned communications relay, listening as distant boot steps echoed somewhere ahead. His weathered face tightened with concern. "Too late," he murmured to himself. "They're all too late." Then, pushing the cart forward once more, he disappeared deeper into the labyrinth, where converging paths were slowly drawing every player toward the same hidden heart beneath the mountain. The old technician continued through the forgotten service corridor with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew every uneven plate beneath his boots. The utility cart rattled softly over cracked durasteel, its wheels squeaking just loudly enough to blend with the constant chorus of pumps and ventilation fans. Every few meters he glanced toward aging security cameras mounted high along the walls. Most had stopped functioning years ago, their lenses coated in grime, but he treated each one as though it remained connected to an alert operator. Caution had kept him alive through decades of imperial rule, and he had no intention of abandoning it now. Hidden beneath spare valves and coolant hoses, the data cylinders represented years of quiet theft, copied one fragment at a time from systems that believed a maintenance worker incapable of understanding what he read. The man's name was Harlan Dace, though few officers ever bothered to learn it. To them, he had always been another aging technician assigned to keep ancient machinery alive long after newer equipment should have replaced it. That anonymity had become his greatest protection. While officers discussed strategy and engineers debated production quotas, Harlan repaired conduits, recalibrated pressure regulators, and listened. He learned which sections of the underground complex truly mattered, which commanders feared inspection, and which records vanished from official archives without explanation. Over time, he realized the Empire hid more beneath Vondaris than factories and fuel. It had buried contingency plans so destructive that merely reading them had left him unable to sleep for nights. Several kilometers away, Corin guided the new Republic team through a maintenance shaft barely wide enough for one person at a time. Thick bundles of power cables filled one wall, while warm coolant pipes occupied the other, leaving only a narrow passage between them. The confined space forced everyone to move carefully, their equipment scraping softly against metal supports whenever someone misjudged a step. Bren muttered under his breath as his pack snagged on an exposed conduit. Whoever designed this place hated maintenance crews. Corin almost smiled despite the tension. No, he replied quietly. They hated the idea of intruders. The crews simply paid the price. The shaft opened into a circular inspection chamber where dozens of smaller tunnels branched outward like spokes from the hub of a great wheel. A large pressure regulator dominated the center of the room, its massive pistons rising and falling with slow mechanical precision. Lyra studied the junction while comparing it against the incomplete map stored in her data pad. We're deeper than any Republic survey has ever reached, she observed. Officially, this level doesn't exist. Corin walked around the regulator until he found faded white markings, almost erased by time. He brushed away another layer of dust and nodded. This chamber connected every emergency maintenance route beneath the refineries. During construction, we called it the Crossroads. His voice lowered almost unconsciously. It was supposed to save lives during accidents. Yuhan. Bren paused beside one of the branching corridors and crouched near a series of fresh boot prints left in the thin layer of gray dust covering the floor. Unlike the abandoned sections above, this place showed unmistakable signs of recent activity. Several tracks belonged to stormtrooper armor, but others came from workers wearing heavy industrial boots. Some prints moved toward the lower command sectors. Others hurried back the opposite way with longer strides that suggested urgency rather than routine travel. Bren traced one impression with a gloved finger. They're moving equipment, he said. Heavy equipment. Lyra examined the deeper grooves. Or carrying something they don't want to leave behind. At that very moment, inside Fortress Aurek, Governor Solvin arrived without invitation. The guards hesitated as his official transport entered the outer courtyard, uncertain whether protocol required them to deny access to the civilian governor or salute him. They ultimately chose the safer option and allowed him through after a brief delay. Solvin walked briskly across polished corridors lined with banners bearing the imperial crest, noticing how empty the fortress had become. Entire offices stood abandoned, their personnel reassigned to security details or maintenance duties elsewhere. When he finally entered Colonel Voss's command chamber, the older officer remained standing over a holographic projection instead of offering any greeting. You ignored my transmissions, Solvin said evenly, refusing to be intimidated. I had more pressing matters. The evacuation orders explained them. Voss slowly looked up from the display. His expression revealed neither anger nor surprise, only a weary certainty that the conversation would accomplish nothing. There is nothing to explain. There are hundreds of thousands of civilians in those districts. There are assets beneath them worth far more than factories. Solvin stared at him in disbelief before realizing what those words truly implied. You aren't protecting the people, he said quietly. You're protecting whatever lies underground. Voss offered no denial. Silence settled heavily between them until Solvin finally spoke again. "If your orders threaten this world, I will countermand them." The colonel's eyes hardened. "You no longer possess that authority." Back beneath the mountain, the team reached a sealed blast door marked with faded engineering symbols rather than military designations. Corrin immediately recognized it. Years ago, it had separated civilian maintenance sectors from classified Imperial infrastructure, ensuring that ordinary workers could never wander into restricted areas even during emergencies. He knelt before the ancient control panel and removed its rusted protective cover. The circuitry beneath remained surprisingly intact despite its age. "Power still flowing," he whispered. "That's good." Bren glanced toward the tunnel behind them. "You don't sound convinced." Corrin inserted a compact bypass tool into the access port, because if the door still has power, someone may notice when it opens. His fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision that returned almost instinctively after years away. Several indicator lights flickered from red to amber before settling on green. The thick blast door shuddered, releasing centuries of trapped dust as ancient hydraulic systems reluctantly obeyed their commands. A deep, grinding noise rolled through the tunnel while the barrier slowly withdrew into the surrounding wall. Everyone froze, listening for alarms. None came. Beyond the doorway stretched another corridor, unlike anything they had seen so far. The walls were cleaner. Lighting strips burned steadily overhead. Fresh maintenance markings covered the floor. Someone had been using this route regularly. The passage led them toward a broad observation gallery overlooking one of the underground reservoirs. Even Corrin stopped in astonishment. The chamber extended so far into the darkness that their lights could not reveal its opposite end. Beneath transparent armored panels lay an immense lake of glowing amber hyperfuel, perfectly still except for faint ripples created by circulating pumps hidden somewhere below the surface. Cooling towers surrounded the reservoir, releasing pale mist that drifted lazily beneath the ceiling, while enormous magnetic stabilizers pulsed with rhythmic blue light. The fuel illuminated every face with an eerie golden glow. Lyra found herself whispering despite the distance separating them from anyone else. "By the stars," Bren finished the thought without taking his eyes from the reservoir. "Enough to power an entire fleet." Corrin leaned against the observation rail, horror gradually replacing amazement. During construction, the fuel had been distributed among several independent storage sectors, specifically to prevent catastrophic chain reactions. What lay before him violated every safety doctrine he had ever followed. Additional transfer pipelines now fed into the same reservoir from multiple directions, each one installed years after he deserted. They consolidated the reserves, he said almost to himself. Someone connected everything together. Lyra looked sharply toward him. "Why would they do that?" Corrin swallowed before answering. "Because one ignition point is easier to control than 20. Though before anyone could respond, Bren raised a clenched fist. Movement. Across the immense chamber, barely visible through drifting mist, several technicians escorted by stormtroopers crossed an elevated platform toward another control station. One worker stumbled from exhaustion, earning a shove from the nearest soldier before continuing. Large equipment cases rolled behind them on anti-grav sleds, each marked with warning symbols indicating thermal control components. Lyra quietly activated the magnification on her macro binoculars. What she saw made her blood run cold. They're replacing coolant regulators. Corin looked at her immediately. "No," he whispered. She lowered the binoculars. "They're removing them." Several long seconds passed before anyone spoke again. The realization settled over the group with terrible clarity. Colonel Voss was not merely preparing defenses against a New Republic assault. He was systematically dismantling the very systems designed to prevent the underground fuel network from destroying itself. Every regulator removed, every safeguard bypassed, every emergency valve locked open brought the planet one step closer to irreversible catastrophe. Far behind them, in another forgotten corridor, where the echoes of machinery concealed quieter sounds, Harlan Dace stopped his utility cart once more. He listened carefully, certain he had heard voices carried faintly through the ventilation network. They were unfamiliar voices, not Imperial commands, not frightened workers, different. Hope stirred within him for the first time in many months, though experience urged caution before belief. He lifted one of the hidden data cylinders from beneath the cart, slipped it inside his coat, and turned toward the sound, knowing that if strangers had truly reached the lower levels, then fate had finally begun moving faster than Colonel Garrick Voss. No one spoke for several long moments after the technicians disappeared into the mist beyond the reservoir. The immense chamber seemed to swallow every sound except the steady pulse of coolant pumps and the low electrical hum of magnetic stabilizers holding the volatile fuel in equilibrium. Corin stared through the transparasteel barrier as memories collided with what lay before him. He remembered arguing during the design phase that redundant cooling systems were essential, not because accidents were likely, but because even the smallest failure could cascade beyond anyone's control. Imperial procurement officers had approved the expense without hesitation, valuing military assets above human lives. Now those same safeguards were being dismantled by Imperial hands. "He's not bluffing," Corin said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Voss intends to burn the entire mountain." Commander Lyra Sen stepped away from the observation rail and crouched beside a maintenance terminal recessed into the wall. Most of its display had faded into unreadable streaks, yet enough circuitry remained active for her slicer interface to establish a fragile connection. Data crawled across the screen in fragmented bursts as outdated operating systems struggled to communicate with modern equipment. Bren stood watch behind her, his rifle covering both approaches to the gallery. Every few seconds he glanced toward the distant platforms where stormtroopers continued escorting work crews between machinery that should never have been touched. "Tell me you can find something useful," he murmured. Lyra never looked up. "I'm trying to convince a 20-year-old computer that I belong here. It isn't impressed." Corin wandered farther along the observation deck until he reached another panel overlooking the glowing reservoir. Small maintenance labels remained attached to nearby piping, each one carrying his own handwriting beneath faded inspection stamps. He reached out almost unconsciously and touched one of the tags with his fingertips. Time seemed to fold in upon itself. He could almost hear younger engineers debating schedules while welding sparks danced through the unfinished chamber, believing they were constructing infrastructure that would preserve order across the galaxy. None of them had imagined this place becoming an executioner's blade suspended beneath an entire planet. Shame settled heavily inside him, but there was no room left for regret. Action mattered now. A soft electronic tone broke the silence. "I have something," Lyra announced. The others gathered around the terminal as she projected a crude wireframe schematic onto her data pad. Large sections remained corrupted, but several blinking indicators stood out clearly among the damaged files. One symbol marked the reservoir where they currently stood. 4 others surrounded it in concentric layers deep beneath the mountain. "These are thermal control hubs," Corrin said immediately. Lyra nodded. "They're coming online one after another." Bren frowned. "I thought they were removing regulators."
"They are," Corrin replied. He studied the pattern for several more seconds before understanding what Voss had truly built. "The hubs aren't cooling the fuel anymore." His voice grew noticeably quieter. "They're heating it." The implication settled over the group like another layer of ash. Instead of igniting the fuel directly, Colonel Voss intended to increase temperatures throughout the underground network until the reservoirs reached a point where the entire system would sustain its own catastrophic reaction. Even destroying one control station would accomplish little once enough heat accumulated. The mountain itself would become the weapon. Miles away inside Fortress Aurek, Governor Solvin refused to leave. He remained standing in the command chamber despite repeated requests from Voss's aides to return to the civilian district. Through reinforced windows, the governor watched transport convoys departing the fortress toward industrial sectors with unusual frequency. None carried food or medical supplies. Every vehicle hauled engineering equipment, reactor components, or sealed military containers whose contents remained classified even from him. "You've already begun," Solvin said quietly. Colonel Voss did not deny it. "You should concern yourself with maintaining order in the city." "There won't be a city if you're doing what I think." "There will be no victory for the Republic either." Solvin took one slow step closer. "They'll never forgive this." Voss finally met his eyes. "I am not seeking forgiveness." The conversation ended there because both men understood no further argument could bridge the distance between them. Far beneath the administrative district, Harlan Dace abandoned his utility cart behind an inactive pump station and continued alone through a ventilation passage too narrow for vehicles. The hidden data cylinder pressed against his chest beneath his worn jacket as he moved with surprising agility despite his age. He paused often, listening for voices drifting through intersecting tunnels. Twice he heard stormtrooper patrols passing close enough that fragments of conversation became clear before fading once more into the endless mechanical echoes. They spoke of increased security around the command vault and accelerated work schedules. One complained that Colonel Voss had forbidden anyone from requesting transfers to surface duty. Harlan understood why. Men asked fewer questions when they believed there was nowhere else to go. The New Republic team left the observation gallery by a secondary maintenance route that curved beneath the reservoir instead of around it. Corrin preferred avoiding the main corridors, now that security patrols had increased. The tunnel sloped downward at a steeper angle than those above, carrying them toward the oldest foundations of the industrial complex
where exposed bedrock replaced finished walls. Here, the Empire's precise engineering gave way to rough excavation scars left by enormous mining machines decades earlier. Massive support columns disappeared upward into darkness, while narrow streams of warm water trickled through cracks in the stone before vanishing beneath grated drainage channels. Every surface vibrated faintly with the constant heartbeat of machinery operating somewhere beyond sight. They had traveled perhaps another kilometer when Bren suddenly raised a clenched fist. Voices, not the clipped discipline of stormtroopers. Workers. Lyra extinguished her lamp immediately, and the others followed suit until only distant maintenance lights illuminated the passage. Around the next bend, 5 civilian technicians pushed a heavily loaded grav sled toward an equipment lift guarded by 2 stormtroopers. Their coveralls were stained with coolant and soot, their faces hollow with exhaustion. One younger worker glanced repeatedly toward the nearest emergency exit sign as though measuring impossible odds. An older technician quietly shook his head without speaking, and the younger man lowered his gaze once more. Bren watched from concealment. Idiot. They're forced labor. Corrin's expression hardened. They weren't always. The group waited until the workers disappeared into the lift before moving again. No one suggested intervening. Attacking now would reveal their presence and accomplish little for those already trapped inside Imperial control. The decision weighed heavily on each of them, particularly Bren, whose instincts rebelled against leaving civilians behind. Lyra noticed the conflict in his face. "We stop Voss," she said softly. "Then we come back for everyone else." Bren gave a reluctant nod, though the promise sounded painfully fragile inside such a vast underground prison. Several corridors later, Corrin halted so abruptly that Lyra nearly walked into him. Ahead stood another blast door. Unlike the others, this one remained partially open. Fresh scrape marks scarred the floor beneath it, suggesting heavy equipment had passed through only hours earlier. Beyond the doorway stretched a brightly lit service station filled with stacked supply crates and portable generators awaiting transport. More importantly, voices echoed from somewhere beyond the room. Corrin pointed toward a narrow inspection hatch set low into the adjacent wall. "That bypasses the station," he whispered. "It comes out beyond the checkpoint." Bren examined the opening with open skepticism. "I don't suppose they designed it for armored soldiers?" Corrin allowed himself the faintest smile. "No. They designed it for engineers who hated paperwork." One by one, they squeezed through the cramped crawl space, dragging weapons and packs behind them while every movement echoed uncomfortably through the enclosed duct. Metal pressed against shoulders and knees, forcing slow, awkward progress through decades of accumulated dust. Halfway through, Bren's equipment caught briefly against an old reinforcement bracket. The sharp scrape rang through the confined tunnel far louder than anyone expected. Silence followed. Then came another sound. Not from inside the crawl space, from the service station beyond. Bootsteps. Several pairs. Approaching. The 4 intruders froze where they lay, scarcely daring to breathe as the footsteps stopped directly outside the hidden maintenance hatch. A voice spoke only a meter away through the thin metal separating them. "I heard something." Another answered after a pause. "Probably vermin." "No," the first voice replied. It sounded heavier than that. The locking mechanism on the hatch gave the faintest metallic click. Someone had begun turning the release wheel from the outside. Inside the cramped maintenance duct, no one moved. The confined space left barely enough room to draw a full breath, and even that seemed dangerously loud as the hatch wheel turned another fraction, with a protesting groan. Bren slowly shifted his grip on the blaster carbine pressed beneath his chest, calculating how many shots he could fire before the narrow passage became a death trap. Lyra raised one gloved hand without looking back, silently ordering him to wait. Corin closed his eyes for the briefest moment, listening not to the hatch, but to the voices beyond it. Something about the cadence sounded familiar, carrying the weary impatience of technicians rather than the clipped certainty of soldiers. The wheel stopped. One of the men outside gave the hatch an impatient shove that failed to move it more than a centimeter before decades of accumulated corrosion held it firmly in place again. Metal scraped against metal with a dull, unpleasant sound that echoed through the duct, followed by a frustrated sigh. "Forget it," another voice muttered. "Maintenance sealed half these crawl spaces years ago." The first man remained unconvinced. "I still heard something." A stormtrooper answered before anyone else could speak. "If it was important, the scanners would have found it. Keep moving. Colonel's orders." Colonel's boots shifted across the floor, and after several agonizing seconds, the footsteps gradually faded down the corridor until only the constant vibration of distant machinery remained. Bren exhaled slowly through clenched teeth. "That was too close." "No," Corin whispered. "It was lucky." Lyra looked back toward him. "Lucky doesn't last forever. Neither does surprise." She let the words settle for a moment before motioning everyone forward again. The crawl space twisted sharply before opening into a vertical access shaft where an old maintenance ladder descended another 20 meters into darkness. They climbed down one at a time, emerging into a circular equipment room abandoned long before the surrounding sectors had been modernized. Dust lay thick across unused tool cabinets, while obsolete repair droids stood motionless beneath protective tarps whose fabric had begun disintegrating with age. Only the emergency lighting remained functional, bathing the chamber in a dim amber glow that left the far corners hidden beneath shifting shadows. Corin walked toward a large wall map still mounted beside the exit. Time had peeled away much of its surface, but enough remained to orient himself. He frowned almost immediately. "This isn't right." Lyra stepped beside him. "What changed?" "I remember 3 corridors leaving this room." He pointed toward a section where solid durasteel now blocked what had once been an open passage. "They built another wall?" Bren inspected the fresh construction. Compared to the surrounding architecture, the barrier looked almost new. "They're funneling movement." Corin nodded. "They're forcing everyone through monitored checkpoints." Far above them, Governor Solvin returned to the civilian administration complex with a resolve that had replaced uncertainty. He summoned only a handful of trusted officials, men and women who had served the planet longer than they had served the Empire. None asked why the meeting took place behind locked doors without military representatives present. They saw the answer in the governor's face before he spoke a single word. "I believe Colonel Voss intends to destroy Vondaris." Silence filled the room.
One advisor gave a short, incredulous laugh that died almost immediately. Destroy it? He would destroy the refineries? Sullivan slowly shook his head. No. The entire world. The weight of those words settled over everyone present. Some stared at the table. Others instinctively glanced toward the windows, overlooking the sprawling industrial city beyond. At last, an elderly logistics coordinator spoke. If you're correct, Governor, then we no longer answer to the military. Sullivan met every pair of eyes around the room. No. We answer to the people. The decision carried consequences none of them could fully measure. Hidden several levels beneath the governor's offices, Harlan Dace finally reached an abandoned relay station that had escaped modernization because newer communication systems had replaced it decades earlier. Dust covered every console, yet the old emergency transmitter remained exactly where he remembered. It had never possessed enough power to contact orbit, but it could still reach maintenance terminals throughout the underground complex. Harlan wiped grime from the controls and connected one of his stolen data cylinders. Ancient processors awakened reluctantly, filling the chamber with the soft clicking of mechanical relays engaging after years of silence. He began transmitting. Not words, maps, engineering schematics, emergency bypass codes. Everything he had quietly stolen over the years poured into forgotten maintenance channels that few Imperial officers even remembered existed. Somewhere, someone might receive them, or perhaps no one would. Either way, he refused to let the knowledge die with him. Deep below the mountain, the New Republic team continued through increasingly active sectors where evidence of recent work appeared around every corner. Fresh welding scars crossed old support beams. Newly installed sensor nodes watched intersections previously left unsecured. Portable power cables snaked across the floor toward equipment that hummed with unsettling intensity behind temporary blast shields. Workers hurried past carrying diagnostic tools, while escorted by armed stormtroopers, leaving little opportunity for the intruders to move openly. More than once the team pressed into narrow maintenance recesses, while patrols marched by within arm's reach. Eventually, Corrin stopped before another sealed maintenance alcove. He knelt beside a compact service terminal built directly into the wall. I need 1 minute. Bren frowned. For what? Corrin plugged a cable into the ancient interface. If I can access local engineering logs, we'll know exactly how much of the cooling network they've already disabled. The terminal flickered uncertainly. Lines of text crawled across the screen, disappearing almost as quickly as they appeared. Corrupted records mixed with recent maintenance updates until the system finally accepted his credentials. Corrin stared silently at the display. His face slowly lost what little color remained. Lyra immediately noticed. What is it? Corrin swallowed. They've shut down 68% of the cooling regulators. He continued reading. The remaining systems are scheduled for deactivation within 6 hours. Bren looked from the terminal toward the darkness ahead. Then we don't have much time. Corrin's expression remained fixed on the screen. No. He spoke almost mechanically. We have less than that. Before anyone could ask why, warning indicators flashed across the display. A thermal graph rose steadily despite every cooling system still operating. Lyra leaned closer. The temperature's already increasing. Corin nodded once. The reaction has begun. The mountain was heating from within. They abandoned the terminal and moved as quickly as caution allowed through a maze of intersecting service corridors that steadily descended towards the command sectors. Every level they crossed felt warmer than the last. At first, the difference was barely noticeable beneath their uniforms. Then condensation began forming along exposed pipes where cooler coolant struggled against rising ambient temperatures. Finally, even the air itself carried an uncomfortable heaviness that seemed entirely wrong for subterranean tunnels designed around precise environmental control. Bren touched one of the handrails while passing. He jerked his hand back. It's warm. Corin looked at the metal. It shouldn't be. Even the structural supports were absorbing excess heat now. That meant the process had spread beyond individual reservoirs. It had reached the surrounding infrastructure. Suddenly, a soft chime sounded from Lyra's field receiver. She looked down in surprise. "I've got a transmission?" Bren stared. "From the Vigilant Dawn?" She shook her head. No frequency match. Static crackled briefly before a distorted voice emerged through layers of interference. "If anyone hears Maintenance Relay 7, the signal nearly vanished. "Command vault, emergency conduit." Another burst of static. "Coolant bypass, my only path left." And silence. The four exchanged uncertain glances. Corin frowned deeply. "That wasn't military." "No," Lyra agreed. "It sounded like a maintenance worker." Bren looked toward the maze of tunnels stretching ahead. "So someone down here wants to help us." "We?" Corin's expression remained thoughtful. "Or someone wants us walking into a trap." Before anyone could decide, the corridor lights abruptly dimmed. Emergency sirens echoed through the lower complex for the first time. A calm, automated voice repeated the same announcement over hidden speakers. "Thermal containment phase 1 initiated." The words repeated again and again. Each repetition sounded colder than the last. Somewhere deep beneath Vonderus, enormous machinery responded. Massive valves rotated open. Coolant pumps slowed. Heat began flowing exactly where Colonel Garrick Voss intended it to go. The automated announcement continued to echo through the tunnels long after the mechanical voice fell silent. Each repetition blended into the steady rumble beneath the floor until it became impossible to tell where the warning ended and the machinery began. Warm air drifted through the corridor in slow, unnatural currents, carrying with it the sharp, metallic scent of heated coolant and the faint odor of scorched insulation. Small beads of moisture evaporated from the walls almost as quickly as they formed, leaving pale mineral stains behind. Corin looked upward toward the maze of pipes crossing the ceiling and felt a knot tighten in his chest. The mountain was no longer merely warming. It had begun changing. Lyra replayed the intercepted transmission several times through her wrist receiver, adjusting filters in the hope of recovering more words hidden beneath the static. The distorted voice remained badly fragmented, but one detail became clearer with each attempt. "Maintenance Relay 7, she said quietly. Whoever sent that expected someone to recognize the location. Corin nodded almost immediately. "I do." Bren looked at him with open expectation. "Can it take us to the command vault?" Corin hesitated before answering. "Not directly. It connects to an emergency bypass built during construction." The tunnel was supposed to allow engineers to isolate reactor failures without crossing military checkpoints. He looked down the corridor ahead. If the passage still exists, it may be the only route Voss hasn't sealed. They altered course, leaving the broader service corridors for a narrower passage hidden behind an aging pressure door whose faded warning markings had almost disappeared beneath layers of soot. The door resisted at first, then surrendered with a long, weary groan as Bren forced it open using a hydraulic spreader. Beyond lay a tunnel that felt older than everything surrounding it. Rough stone walls stood exposed where construction had ended decades before, interrupted only by occasional reinforcement arches bolted directly into the bedrock. Thick electrical cables ran overhead without protective conduits, evidence that the passage had been completed quickly during the earliest days of the project. Their footsteps echoed differently here, softer, absorbed by natural rock rather than reflected by polished steel. Several hundred meters farther on, they found Maintenance Relay 7. The station occupied a circular chamber carved directly into the mountain, its equipment far older than the systems surrounding it. Ancient communications consoles lined one wall, while mechanical switching arrays filled another, each relay clicking methodically, despite the decades that had passed since anyone officially maintained them. A portable work lamp illuminated the room from the corner, its battery still fresh. Someone had been here recently. Lyra crouched beside the transmitter. The signal came from this terminal. Corin examined the controls. It was sent only minutes ago. Bren swept his rifle across every entrance. Then where did the sender go? No one answered. The room felt occupied despite being empty. A faint scraping sound drifted through one of the adjoining passages. All 4 weapons turned toward the darkness. The sound stopped, then resumed, slower this time. An elderly man emerged with both hands raised well away from his body. His clothes were stained with grease and dust, his gray beard unevenly trimmed, and deep lines marked a face that had spent many years beneath artificial light instead of open skies. A worn maintenance badge hung from his jacket, though the lettering had become almost unreadable. I was beginning to think nobody would come, he said. His voice matched the one from the transmission. Corin lowered his blaster first. Harlan? The older man's tired eyes widened in genuine surprise. Corin Malik. For a heartbeat, neither man spoke. Years of shared memories crossed silently between them while the others remained watchful. Harlan finally smiled, though sorrow softened the expression before it fully formed. I heard you deserted. I did. I always hoped one day I'd meet someone who managed it. Corin stepped forward and clasped the older man's forearm. I should have convinced you to leave with me. Harlan slowly shook his head. If I had gone, nobody would have stayed behind to watch what Voss was building. Lyra relaxed only slightly. You've been collecting information. Harlan reached inside his jacket and produced the remaining data cylinder. I've been collecting proof. They gathered around one of the surviving consoles while Harlan connected the cylinder to the relay terminal. Layer after layer of engineering records unfolded across the aging display, revealing sectors omitted from every official schematic the New Republic possessed. Corin leaned closer, recognizing areas even he had never been authorized to enter during construction.
Hidden chambers branched beneath the command vault, linking fuel regulators, reactor controls, and emergency venting systems into a network that existed outside ordinary maintenance authority. Harlan pointed toward a circular structure positioned directly beneath Colonel Voss's headquarters. That's the ignition nexus. Corin frowned. I've never seen this.
You weren't meant to. Harlan tapped another section. The Emperor ordered it added after construction began. Lyra's eyes narrowed. What does it do? The old technician answered without hesitation. It synchronizes every thermal control hub beneath the planet. Silence settled over the chamber. Bren finally spoke. So if we destroy it? Harlan interrupted gently. It won't matter. Every face turned toward him. The sequence has already progressed too far. He looked almost apologetic. The Nexus only starts the process. He pointed toward another chamber deeper still. Stopping it now requires shutting down the primary heat exchange reactor. Corin studied the newly revealed schematic. The reactor lay beneath layers of reinforced blast doors, separated from the command vault by only a few hundred meters of tunnel. Which means, Bren muttered, it's also the most heavily guarded place underground. Harlan gave a weary nod. Exactly. Far above, Governor Solvin's quiet preparations had begun spreading through the civilian districts. Official notices ordered hospitals to prepare emergency transport convoys under the pretense of industrial safety inspections. Freight operators received requests to fuel every available vehicle. Local administrators quietly unlocked long-sealed evacuation shelters whose existence many younger citizens had never known. None understood the true reason behind these sudden directives, yet word traveled quickly through neighborhoods already accustomed to reading between official lines. The military noticed. Inside Fortress Aurek, an intelligence officer hurried into Colonel Voss's command center carrying a fresh report. Governor Solvin is mobilizing civilian resources without authorization. Voss barely looked up from the thermal displays filling the central holotable. For what purpose? We're uncertain. He claims precautionary emergency planning. Voss considered that for only a moment. Place military observers at every evacuation center. The officer hesitated. Should we detain the governor? For the first time in several minutes, Voss lifted his eyes. No. He finally understands something is happening. A faint trace of sadness crossed his otherwise disciplined features. It no longer matters. Back at Relay 7, Harlan opened another engineering file hidden within the stolen archives. This one contained security rotations rather than reactor schematics. He enlarged the lower command sectors until a pattern became obvious. The guards believe every approach to the reactor passes through military checkpoints. His finger moved toward a thin maintenance conduit barely visible beneath overlapping structural layers. They're wrong. Corin recognized the passage immediately. The drainage conduit. I thought it had been sealed. So did they, Harlan replied. It collapsed during construction. He smiled faintly. The collapse never reached the entire tunnel. Lyra followed the route with her finger. It comes out here. She pointed beside the primary reactor chamber. Less than 50 meters away. Bren looked toward the darkness beyond the relay station. So we have a path. Corin's expression remained grim. We have a chance. Harlan disconnected the data cylinder and carefully slipped it back into his pocket. You'll need more than maps. He walked toward an old storage locker hidden behind obsolete communications equipment. After several attempts, the rusted door finally opened. Inside rested 4 insulated maintenance uniforms, each marked with engineering insignia instead of military identification. I've kept these ready for years. Corin looked at the uniforms in quiet disbelief. You expected this? Harlan closed the locker. I didn't expect victory. He looked at each of them in turn. But I always hoped someone would eventually come. Waya. No one noticed the small sensor hidden high above the relay chamber door. Its cracked housing appeared abandoned like everything else in the room. Moments after the group departed through the drainage tunnel, a tiny red indicator buried beneath years of dust flickered once. Far away inside the command vault, one unnoticed line appeared across an auxiliary security display. Maintenance Relay 7. Motion detected. Colonel Garrick Voss turned his head toward the alert. Then, for the first time since beginning the ignition sequence, he smiled. Colonel Garrick Voss studied the auxiliary security display for several silent seconds, while officers around him continued their work, unaware that anything had changed. The alert remained small, tucked among dozens of routine maintenance notifications that most commanders would have dismissed without a second glance. Yet Voss had spent years learning the hidden architecture beneath Vondaris, and he knew that Maintenance Relay 7 should have remained empty. No scheduled patrols passed through that forgotten sector. No work crews received authorization to enter it. Someone had disturbed a place that existed only in old construction records. Voss reached forward and enlarged the alert with one precise movement. An intelligence lieutenant stepped beside him. Sir? Voss kept his eyes on the display. Dispatch Squad Kappa to the drainage conduit. The lieutenant frowned. The conduit was sealed decades ago. So everyone believes. The colonel finally looked toward him. I prefer certainty. The officer saluted and hurried from the chamber without another question. Voss turned back to the immense holographic projection of the underground complex. More thermal indicators glowed amber now than they had an hour earlier. The reaction was progressing exactly as projected, though slightly faster than the original Imperial simulations had predicted. Heat spread through bedrock with relentless patience, carrying energy into structural supports, reactor housings, and eventually the enormous reservoirs waiting beneath the mountain. The process no longer required constant supervision. Like a carefully tipped stone rolling down a steep slope, it possessed its own momentum. Several levels below, the New Republic team changed into the maintenance uniforms Harlan had hidden years earlier. The heavy gray jackets smelled faintly of old machine oil despite careful storage, while the insulated gloves and helmets bore faded engineering insignia rarely seen outside restricted industrial sectors. Bren looked down at himself with obvious dissatisfaction. I've worn stranger disguises. He adjusted the stiff collar. But not many. Lyra fastened the last fastening strap across her chest. We're not trying to convince anyone from a distance. She looked toward Corin.
We only need a few seconds if we're challenged.
Corrin checked the identification cylinders attached to each uniform. They won't survive detailed inspection, Harlan answered quietly. Then don't give anyone time for one. The drainage conduit began behind an ancient floodgate whose manual locking mechanism required all four of them to turn separate control wheels simultaneously. Rust flaked from the enormous gears as they strained against decades of neglect before finally releasing with a deafening metallic crack that echoed far into the darkness. Cold air rushed from the tunnel beyond, carrying the smell of wet stone instead of machinery. Unlike the maintained passages above, this conduit belonged more to the mountain than to the Empire. Water flowed ankle-deep across the uneven floor, reflecting their lamps in broken ribbons of pale light. Jagged rock pressed close on both sides where the original collapse had narrowed the road into little more than a natural fissure. Harlan led them confidently despite the difficult footing. I found this section by accident 15 years ago. His voice echoed strangely through the stone. A pressure survey detected empty space beyond the cave-in. Corrin shone his light toward fractured support beams still protruding from the walls. I remember the reports. They claimed the collapse buried everything. Harlan smiled without looking back. The reports were convenient. You left them uncorrected. I learned when silence was more useful than honesty. The tunnel twisted sharply several times before widening into a partially collapsed cavern where remnants of unfinished construction still littered the ground. Broken scaffolding leaned against exposed bedrock, while abandoned drilling equipment rested beneath thick mineral deposits left by countless years of slow-moving groundwater. Several old Republic-era mining machines, long predating the Empire itself, stood where workers had abandoned them when construction priorities shifted elsewhere. Bren paused beside one of the corroded vehicles. This place is a graveyard. Corrin nodded. They built the military complex around it. The Empire rarely wasted time removing what it could simply bury. The warmth beneath their boots steadily increased. At first, only Corrin noticed. Then Harlan stopped unexpectedly and knelt beside a shallow stream crossing the cavern floor. He dipped gloved fingers into the flowing water before withdrawing them almost immediately. It shouldn't be this warm. Lyra crouched beside him. The reactor? Harlan slowly shook his head. No. The groundwater. His face tightened. The surrounding rock is heating faster than expected. No one needed to explain what that meant. If the mountain itself had begun absorbing excess thermal energy, then the process had advanced beyond the reactors alone. Time was slipping away. Back within the civilian districts, Governor Sullivan abandoned secrecy. He stood atop the administration building overlooking thousands of workers gathering below after emergency sirens interrupted the afternoon shift. Confused conversations rolled through the crowd, while transport vehicles assembled in long columns across nearby avenues. Military observers watched from surrounding rooftops, uncertain whether they possessed authority to intervene. Sullivan activated the public address system. My fellow citizens, his voice echoed across the square. I have served this government for many years. He paused, choosing truth over caution.
Today I tell you that remaining here places every life at risk. Shock spread visibly through the crowd. There is no time for full explanations. He looked across the sea of anxious faces. Take your families. Take only what you can carry. Leave the industrial districts immediately. A woman near the front called out. Is the Republic attacking? Sullivan answered with painful honesty. No. The danger comes from beneath our feet. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then an elderly miner quietly picked up his bag. His wife followed. Others watched them. Soon hundreds were walking. Then thousands. Panic had not yet begun. Hope had. Inside Fortress Auric, reports of the governor's speech reached Colonel Voss almost immediately. The communications officer waited nervously for an angry response. None came. Instead, Voss simply asked, "How many have left?" "We estimate 20,000 already." "And transportation capacity?" "They cannot evacuate everyone before nightfall." Voss lowered his eyes toward the thermal displays. "They will not have that long." The officer swallowed. "Should we stop them?" Voss remained silent for several moments. Finally, he answered, "No. They deserve the chance." The reply surprised everyone present. For all his ruthless determination, some fragment of the man beneath the uniform still remained. Deep within the mountain, the drainage conduit narrowed once more before ending at a rusted maintenance ladder, climbing toward a circular hatch overhead. Faint electrical light filtered through narrow seams around its edges, proof that active Imperial sectors lay only meters above. Harlan carefully ascended first until one eye reached the inspection slot built into the hatch. He remained motionless, then slowly climbed back down. 2 stormtroopers. Stationary. Watching the corridor. Bren frowned. "I thought this bypass came out beside the reactor?" "It does." Harlan pointed upward. "The reactor access corridor." Lyra studied the surrounding rock. "Any other exits?" Corrin answered immediately, "Mon Dieu sur Ka." "None." Silence settled over the small chamber. The entire mission now depended upon passing 2 guards without raising an alarm. Bren checked the charge on his rifle. "We eliminate them." Lyra considered the idea. "If they fail to report, they'll send another patrol," Corrin finished. Harlan quietly reached into one of the storage pouches sewn inside his maintenance jacket. "I may have another option." He withdrew a small cylindrical device no larger than a hydro spanner handle. Corrin stared. "I haven't seen one of those in years." "What is it?" Bren asked. Harlan turned the cylinder in his hand. "Emergency pressure equalizer." He smiled faintly. "Engineers called it a pipe cough." Lyra looked puzzled. "It releases compressed coolant into nearby conduits." Very loudly. Corrin immediately understood. "It'll sound like a ruptured pressure line." Harlan nodded. "Every trained technician and every guard within hearing distance will run toward the noise. And the corridor will be empty." Bren grinned for the first time since entering the mountain. "I think I like engineers." Before anyone could put the plan into motion, a distant sound drifted through the drainage tunnel behind them. Not water, not machinery, footsteps. Many of them, rhythmic, disciplined, marching closer through the darkness they had only recently crossed. Lyra extinguished her lamp. The others followed instantly. The chamber disappeared into complete blackness. Only the approaching echoes remained. Squad Kappa had found the conduit. Darkness swallowed the chamber so completely that even the outline of a hand vanished before the eyes. The only certainty came from sound. Water trickled through cracks in the stone, warm droplets falling into shallow pools, while the measured cadence of armored boots grew steadily louder through the twisting conduit. No one dared activate a light. Bren slowed his breathing until it matched the distant rhythm of the approaching patrol, while Corin pressed himself against the rough wall, feeling the stone vibrate with every step the stormtroopers took somewhere beyond the bend. Harlan leaned close enough that his whisper barely stirred the air. "The old mining alcove," he breathed. 3 meters to your left." Corin felt along the rock until his fingers brushed splintered timber buried beneath mineral deposits. The opening was almost invisible, hidden behind collapsed supports and curtains of hanging cables abandoned decades earlier. One by one, they slipped into the narrow recess, drawing packs and weapons after them with agonizing care. The space had once sheltered drilling equipment, but time had reduced it to little more than a hollow in the mountain. They crouched shoulder to shoulder, unable to move without brushing against one another. The patrol rounded the corner moments later. Helmet lamps swept across the conduit in overlapping arcs, bright white beams cutting through the darkness where the team had stood only seconds before. 8 stormtroopers advanced in disciplined formation, with 2 black security droids marching at the center of the column. The droids' photoreceptors scanned every surface methodically, pausing on irregularities that the human soldiers ignored. Their servo motors emitted a soft, mechanical whine that somehow sounded more threatening than the boots surrounding them. An Imperial sergeant raised one fist, halting the column. "Motion sensor lost the signal here," he said. "Spread out." Bren tightened his grip on the blaster so firmly that his knuckles ached inside the insulated gloves. If a single trooper stepped into the alcove, the firefight would begin at arm's length. There would be no room for maneuver, no cover worth the name, only muzzle flashes and ricochets inside a stone coffin. Lyra sensed the same calculation unfolding beside her. She rested one hand lightly against Bren's forearm, not to restrain him, but to remind him that the first shot must come only if there was no other choice. Seconds stretched unbearably as searchlights crept across the rock wall just beyond their hiding place. One of the security droids suddenly stopped. "Residual thermal anomaly detected," it announced in its emotionless voice. The sergeant turned immediately. Distance? Approximately 12 meters. The droid rotated its head toward the concealed alcove. Source obscured. Another trooper lifted his blaster. "Should we clear it?" Before the sergeant could answer, a violent metallic bang echoed through the conduit from far behind the patrol. It was followed by a shrill hiss of escaping pressure that reverberated through the mountain. The stormtroopers reacted instantly. "Coolant breach," one shouted. The sergeant cursed under his breath. "Droid 1 with me, the rest secure the line." Without another word, half the patrol broke into a run toward the new disturbance, their footsteps fading rapidly into the darkness. The remaining soldiers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The thermal alert still troubled them, but Imperial discipline favored immediate response to infrastructure failures. After only a few more seconds, the second droid spoke. No additional thermal increase. The sergeant made his decision. Move. The last 4 troopers hurried after their companions, leaving the conduit empty once more. Only after the echoes disappeared completely did anyone inside the alcove move. Bren looked toward Harlan in astonishment. "You planted that?" The old technician gave a tired nod. "Yesterday." Corrin stared at him. "You expected pursuit?" "I expected the Empire." There was no pride in the answer, only quiet experience earned over too many years. Harlan had hidden several emergency pressure equalizers throughout the abandoned conduit long before the New Republic ever arrived. If anyone followed, the diversions would buy precious minutes. Nothing more. They emerged from the alcove and climbed the maintenance ladder beneath the reactor corridor hatch. Harlan slowly rotated the locking wheel till the mechanism disengaged with only the faintest click. He pushed upward just enough to peer through the opening. The corridor beyond lay empty. "The patrol left," he whispered. Bren smiled grimly. "Then let's not waste their generosity." The 4 climbed into the corridor while Harlan secured the hatch behind them. Bright overhead lighting replaced the darkness of the conduit, forcing every eye to adjust. This section of the underground complex contrasted sharply with the neglected maintenance passages they had traveled until now. Floors gleamed beneath fresh polish, warning stripes had been repainted recently, and surveillance cameras watched every intersection from armored housings mounted high along the walls. The Empire had concentrated its remaining resources here. Every meter declared that this place mattered more than any factory or fortress above. Corrin led them toward a heavy blast door marked only with engineering symbols and a string of security clearances. "The primary heat exchange reactor," he said quietly. Lyra studied the control panel. No keypad. Biometric authorization. Corrin frowned. It wasn't like that before. Harlan stepped closer. Voss upgraded the locks. He examined the scanner with narrowing eyes. "There may still be a maintenance override." Or... Before he could continue, voices echoed from the far end of the corridor. An engineering crew approached, escorting 2 repulsor carts loaded with replacement thermal regulators. 6 stormtroopers walked beside them, rifles held ready while exhausted technicians pushed the heavy equipment toward the reactor entrance. The New Republic team had nowhere to hide except shallow service recesses lining the corridor. "Helmets down," Corrin whispered. "Act like you belong." The Imperial convoy drew nearer. One officer glanced casually toward the 4 disguised figures standing beside the maintenance panel. "You've been assigned here?" he asked. Corrin answered without hesitation. "Emergency inspection on coolant manifold 3. The officer frowned. "I wasn't informed." Corrin shrugged with convincing irritation. "Neither were we. The colonel wants every system checked twice." The officer snorted. "He wants everything." He waved dismissively. "Stay out of the way." The convoy continued past them.
Only when the last stormtrooper disappeared around the bend did Bren quietly release the breath he had been holding. That shouldn't have worked. Corin watched the disappearing workers. They're too busy. His expression darkened, which means the schedule's accelerating. Far above, the evacuation had begun to transform into something far larger than Governor Sullivan had dared hope. Entire neighborhoods moved together instead of dissolving into panic. Factory foremen abandoned production lines to organize transport. Mechanics repaired broken speeders in the middle of crowded streets, while miners used heavy drilling vehicles to clear blocked roads. Families who owned little shared what they had with neighbors, carrying even less. The city had not become orderly because of military command. It had become orderly because ordinary people refused to abandon one another. From the roof of the administration building, Sullivan watched endless columns of civilians moving toward the eastern valleys beyond the industrial zone. An aide approached breathlessly. "We've evacuated nearly 90,000. Sullivan nodded slowly. "And the rest?" "They're still coming." He looked toward the distant smokestacks, where dark clouds continued rising into the evening sky. "Tell them to keep moving." His voice grew quieter. "I fear the mountain is moving faster." Deep beneath that same mountain, Harlan finally located a concealed maintenance socket hidden beneath the biometric scanner. He removed a small multi-tool from his pocket and carefully loosened the protective cover. Ancient wires emerged beneath it, their insulation brittle with age but still intact. "This override was never listed in official records," he said. Corin looked surprised. "You helped design it." Harlan gave a faint smile. "No. I insisted upon it." He inserted the tool into the wiring harness. "If engineers couldn't bypass military locks during an emergency..." He looked briefly toward the massive reactor door. "Then eventually the emergency would win." Tiny sparks danced inside the open panel as he crossed 2 contacts. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then somewhere deep inside the blast door, enormous locking bolts began withdrawing one after another. The sound rolled through the corridor like distant thunder. Every member of the team froze, because from somewhere beyond the opening door came another sound. Not machinery, not alarms. Voices. Dozens of them. Imperial officers were already inside the reactor chamber. The final locking bolt withdrew, with a heavy metallic crash that echoed along the corridor before settling into silence. The blast door separated by only a hand's width, leaving a narrow gap through which bright white light spilled into the passage. Warm air flowed through the opening, carrying the sharp scent of ozone, superheated coolant, and fresh welds. Beneath those familiar industrial odors lingered another smell that made Corin's stomach tighten. Something electrical had already begun burning. It was faint, almost hidden beneath everything else, but once recognized, it could not be ignored. No one rushed forward. Harlan slowly placed one eye against the narrow opening, while the others waited in absolute stillness behind him. The elderly technician remained there for several long seconds before carefully stepping back. His face had lost what little color remained beneath years of grease and exhaustion. "There are more than 30 personnel inside," he whispered. "Engineers, officers, stormtroopers. They're working around the reactor itself." Bren frowned immediately. 30? Harlan nodded.
At least, this isn't a control room anymore. It's the heart of the operation. Lyra looked toward the widening crack of the blast door. Then we aren't getting through unnoticed. Corrin quietly peered through the opening himself. The reactor chamber stretched farther than he remembered, a cathedral of machinery descending through multiple levels connected by suspended walkways and maintenance lifts. At its center rose the primary heat exchange reactor, an immense cylindrical structure surrounded by concentric coolant rings glowing pale blue beneath transparent shielding. Heavy transfer pipes extended outward in every direction, like the roots of an enormous tree, disappearing into reinforced walls that fed every thermal hub beneath the mountain. Workers hurried along elevated platforms, replacing coolant regulators with modified thermal amplifiers, while stormtroopers guarded each level. Above them all, overlooking the chamber from a command balcony, stood Colonel Garrick Voss. For a brief instant, Corrin forgot to breathe. The colonel looked older than he remembered, but not weaker. Years of isolation had carved deeper lines into his face without softening the discipline in his posture. His immaculate uniform contrasted sharply with the frantic activity below, as though the chaos surrounding him belonged to someone else's world. Officers approached with reports, received concise orders, and hurried away again while Voss barely shifted his position. He watched the reactor with quiet concentration instead of triumph. There was no celebration in his expression, only the unwavering certainty of a man carrying out what he believed was his final duty. Lyra gently pulled Corrin away from the opening before anyone inside could notice movement. "Can we stop the reactor from here?" she asked. Corrin closed his eyes for a moment, rebuilding the chamber from memory while comparing it against what he had just seen. "No," he answered. "Not remotely. The primary control assemblies are beneath the central platform." Harlan added another grim detail. "And those amplifiers they're installing are bypassing every automatic safety system." Bren rested the stock of his rifle against the floor. "Then we fight our way in." Corrin looked at him steadily. "If shooting starts before we reach the controls, someone will trigger the ignition sequence manually." They retreated several meters down the corridor where an abandoned maintenance station offered enough cover to speak without risking detection. Harlan unfolded the engineering schematics across the dusty workbench, tracing hidden service routes with a trembling finger. "There used to be an inspection gantry beneath the reactor floor," he said. "Only engineers servicing coolant pumps ever used it." Corrin immediately recognized the route. "Accessed through the drainage manifold." Harlan nodded. "If it still exists, it brings you directly beneath the control platform." Bren studied the map carefully. "How do we reach it?" Harlan pointed toward another maintenance shaft branching away from the corridor. "Through there. But once you're below the reactor, there won't be another way out." Far above, Governor Sullivan stood beside the Eastern Evacuation Road, watching endless columns of civilians disappear into the valleys beyond the industrial basin. Smoke drifted overhead while transport speeders, cargo haulers, and even ancient mining crawlers carried families away from the city. The governor accepted updates from exhausted coordinators every few minutes, each report bringing both relief and despair. More people escaped with every passing hour, yet too many still remained trapped inside districts where transportation had failed or elderly residents could not travel quickly enough. Solvin looked back toward the dark silhouette of the factory. The distant groan of ancient engines rolls through the smoke. Welcome, my friends. Draw a little closer and listen while the embers of an old war still glow beneath forgotten mountains, where silence often hides greater danger than the roar of battle. Some worlds vanish into history without ceremony, yet their deepest secrets can change the fate of countless lives. Walk carefully now, keep your eyes upon the fading light, and let the story begin. The Battle of Endor had ended months before, yet the fires it kindled still burned across the galaxy. News of the Emperor's death had traveled faster than any fleet, but belief did not always follow truth, and on countless distant worlds, Imperial officers clung to old orders as though the voice of their master might still echo through a crackling hollow projector. Some garrisons surrendered without a fight, some declared themselves independent warlords, and others prepared to drag entire populations into ruin rather than yield. Far from the crowded core worlds, beyond the trade lanes where victory celebrations had long since faded into routine, one forgotten industrial planet continued to breathe smoke into a gray sky, as if nothing had changed. It had been built to feed war. In every furnace, rail line, and refinery still remembered its purpose. The world was called Vondaris, a place of black mountains carved open by generations of mining machines and rivers that reflected copper instead of blue. Gigantic assembly halls stretched for kilometers beneath armored roofs, while towering chimneys stained the clouds with ash that drifted like dirty snow across abandoned loading yards. Once, transport ships had arrived every hour to carry armored vehicle parts, reactor housings, and starship components to Imperial shipyards throughout the galaxy. Now only a handful of freighters came and went under heavy escort, their captains avoiding unnecessary questions and never lingering longer than required. Even in silence, the factories groaned, their aging machinery coughing and rumbling like enormous beasts refusing to die. Few citizens knew the true extent of the underground complex hidden beneath those factories. Beneath layers of production floors and cargo tunnels lay reservoirs of volatile hyperfuel, enough to sustain years of military campaigns across entire sectors. Engineers had designed the vaults with impossible care, surrounding them with blast doors thicker than the hulls of cruisers and cooling systems that never stopped circulating. Should those safeguards ever fail, the explosion would not merely erase a city, it would split mountains, poison the atmosphere, and leave Vondaris a lifeless scar visible from orbit. Only a handful of Imperial officers still possessed clearance codes to reach those depths, and one of them had already made his decision. Colonel Garrick Voss stood before the reinforced viewport of Fortress Aurek, watching another column of smoke climb into the evening sky. His uniform remained immaculate despite the grime surrounding the fortress, each rank plaque polished with almost obsessive precision, while his gray hair framed a face weathered more by discipline than by age. The officer behind him waited silently, datapad clasped against his chest, unwilling to interrupt until spoken to. At last, Voss broke the silence without turning around. "Any word from Coruscant?" he asked, though his voice carried little expectation. "No confirmation, sir," the younger officer answered quietly. "Only rumors. The New Republic claims control over more systems every week." Voss closed his eyes for a heartbeat before speaking again. Claims are wind, he said. Orders are stone. The words sounded rehearsed, as though he had repeated them to himself every morning since the Battle of Endor. Deep within him lived a truth he refused to acknowledge aloud. He no longer expected rescue from an Imperial fleet, nor did he believe the Emperor would somehow return. Yet surrender felt more unbearable than death, because it demanded admitting that every sacrifice, every campaign, and every command had ended in failure. Pride became armor, and armor could imprison the one wearing it. Across the sector, aboard the New Republic corvette Vigilant Dawn, Captain Terran Vall studied a rotating hologram of Vondaris while stars drifted beyond the bridge viewport. The vessel was modest compared to the cruisers that now formed the backbone of the growing Republic fleet, but it excelled at reconnaissance and rapid deployment into dangerous territory. Around the tactical display stood a small team chosen not for overwhelming firepower, but for adaptability, each member carrying experience gathered during years of rebellion. Their mission appeared simple on paper: verify Imperial activity, determine whether the industrial world could be liberated without devastating casualties, and report before committing larger forces. None of them believed simplicity survived first contact with the Empire. Commander Lyra Sen folded her arms as the hologram expanded to reveal subterranean levels beneath the factories. "These scans are incomplete," she observed, tracing a glowing tunnel that vanished into blank space. Either the archives were corrupted during the war, or someone erased the lower sections deliberately. Beside her, Sergeant Bren Casto gave a humorless grin while checking the charge pack of his blaster rifle. "Whenever someone hides a basement that carefully," he muttered, "it's never full of harmless storage crates." Captain Vale nodded without smiling. He had learned long ago that jokes spoken before missions often concealed instincts people could not explain. The final member of the briefing remained silent until Vale looked directly at him. His name was Corin Malik, once an Imperial engineer responsible for maintenance systems throughout the Vondaris complex before deserting 2 years earlier, after witnessing civilian labor camps expand beyond anything military necessity could justify. He was older than most rebels, his dark hair already threaded with silver, and his hands still carried faint burn scars earned from decades spent around reactors and molten alloys. The hologram illuminated his face with shifting blue light as memories returned uninvited. "Those maps aren't incomplete," he said at last. "They're sanitized. The Empire never allowed full architectural records outside the governor's office." Every pair of eyes settled on Corin as he stepped closer to the projection. He reached toward one section hidden beneath the central refinery and drew invisible lines through empty space from memory alone. "There are maintenance passages here, and beneath this cooling shaft," he explained, his voice steady despite the weight of old recollections. "Officially, they don't exist. We built them so repair crews could reach fuel regulators during emergencies, but intelligence classified the network afterward." Lyra studied him carefully before asking the question lingering in everyone's thoughts. "Can those passages still get us inside?" Corin hesitated just long enough for uncertainty to become visible before answering. "If they haven't collapsed, yes." Captain Vale dismissed the briefing and invited only Corin to remain behind. Once the others had departed, The bridge became quieter, filled only with the distant hum of engines and muted conversations from duty stations. Vale rested both hands against the tactical table. "You don't have to go down there," he said. "Your knowledge has already given us more than command expected." Corrin looked through the viewport toward the stars where Vondaris waited beyond hyperspace. "I helped build the place," he replied softly. "If it's become a weapon against its own people, then part of that burden belongs to me." Val considered the older man for several long moments before speaking again. "Intelligence intercepted fragmented transmissions before we left Chandrila," he said. "Something about fuel transfers and emergency lockdown procedures. They couldn't decrypt everything." Corrin's expression tightened with immediate recognition, not because he understood the message completely, but because certain words carried meanings invisible to outsiders. Emergency lockdowns were never activated merely to defend a refinery. They existed to isolate catastrophic failures before they spread through the underground reservoirs. A chill settled over him that no starship climate controls could explain. The Corvette entered hyperspace before dawn shipboard time, its engines releasing the familiar surge that stretched starlight into luminous rivers. Crew members settled into routines practiced across countless operations, checking equipment, reviewing contingency plans, and pretending the mission ahead would unfold according to careful preparation. Corrin sat alone in a quiet compartment, turning a small Durasteel identification badge over in his scarred hands. The engraved Imperial cog had been scratched nearly beyond recognition years earlier, yet he had never thrown it away because forgetting was easier than understanding. Outside the hull, the galaxy blurred into impossible light, while inside his thoughts wandered through corridors he had hoped never to walk again. Far ahead, beneath Vondaris's endless ceiling of smoke, warning sirens echoed through forgotten levels where few living souls ever ventured. Massive blast doors unlocked with grinding reluctance, revealing tunnels lined by coolant pipes wider than starfighter fuselages and reservoirs that glowed with an uneasy amber light beneath armored transparasteel. Colonel Voss descended alone except for two silent security droids whose photoreceptors swept across every shadow. He reached an ancient command console sealed behind multiple authentication locks and rested his hand upon its cold metal surface. After a long silence, he entered the first authorization code, and somewhere deep beneath the planet, machinery that had slept for decades slowly awakened. The vigilant dawn emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Vondaris system beneath the pale light of a swollen orange star. Immediately, the bridge came alive with restrained urgency as sensor operators compared fresh readings against intelligence gathered weeks earlier, discovering subtle differences that unsettled even the most experienced among them. 3 Imperial patrol craft circled the planet in irregular patterns instead of disciplined formations, their routes constantly shifting as though they expected an attack but no longer trusted one another enough to coordinate properly. Captain Taryn Vale watched the display without speaking, noticing gaps large enough for a careful approach, yet dangerous enough to suggest deliberate bait. Beyond the patrols drifted an aging Gozanti transport and 2 battered customs corvettes that should have been retired years before. A reminder that whatever forces remained loyal to the Empire here were surviving on determination rather than abundant resources. They've been cut off for months, Commander Lyra Sen observed quietly. A desperate garrison can become more dangerous than a confident one. Vol gave a slight nod, knowing desperation often ignored calculations that sane commanders respected. The corvette slipped behind the shadow of the system's outermost moon, reducing its emissions while the crew prepared a shuttle for atmospheric insertion. Sergeant Bren Casto inspected each crate personally, checking explosives, spare power cells, climbing gear, and compact field scanners with the same care he once devoted to maintaining stolen rebel equipment on hidden jungle bases. A young technician secured the final cargo net and hesitated before stepping back. "Sir," she asked cautiously, "if things go wrong down there, how long before the fleet can reach you?" Bren looked toward the closed ramp for a moment before answering. "Long enough that we'd better not count on them." The technician managed a nervous smile, though neither of them found much comfort in the exchange, and Bren climbed aboard, carrying more responsibility than supplies. Corin Malik paused before entering the shuttle, feeling the familiar scent of machine oil drifting from the cargo compartment. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else, yet it reached across years with startling force. He remembered standing in spotless Imperial shipyards, wearing a fresh engineer's uniform, believing efficiency and order could improve the galaxy, despite the harshness surrounding them. Those memories had once carried pride, but now they tasted like metal left too long in the mouth. Commander Sen stepped beside him without interrupting his thoughts. "Still time to stay aboard," she said, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. Corin shook his head slowly. "No," he answered. "If I turn away now, those tunnels will never stop following me." Far below, life continued across Vondaris with uneasy routine because ordinary citizens rarely possessed the luxury of believing history had changed overnight. Workers crossed elevated walkways, suspended between soot-covered buildings, while freight haulers rolled along cracked ferrocrete roads, carrying ore from distant mines that never truly closed. Children hurried through narrow residential districts, wrapped in scarves against the ash that settled almost every afternoon, chasing one another between rows of rusting moisture collectors whose best years had passed decades earlier. They knew little about galactic politics beyond whispered conversations overheard from weary parents. What mattered was whether food shipments arrived on time, whether power remained stable through the night, and whether another round of military inspections disrupted an already difficult existence. The Empire's banners still hung above government offices, faded by smoke and weather, but even those symbols seemed tired beneath the endless gray sky. In the administrative quarter, Governor Enrique Solvan stood inside his office reading reports that refused to agree with one another. Official production figures claimed the factories continued operating at acceptable capacity, yet freight manifests showed fewer shipments leaving orbit every month, while fuel consumption inexplicably increased. He had served the Empire faithfully for nearly 15 years, though unlike Colonel Voss, he possessed little taste for glorious last stands or empty declarations of loyalty. Solvan preferred stability because stability preserved both industry and his own position. When his communications officer entered carrying another encrypted transmission from Fortress Aurek, the governor accepted it with visible reluctance.
The message contained only a brief notice informing civilian authorities that several districts would soon be evacuated for strategic security operations. No explanation accompanied the order, and that silence frightened him far more than any detailed military directive could have. The shuttle pierced Vondaris's cloud layers under reduced power, buffeted by turbulent winds carrying ash and microscopic particles of industrial residue. Rain streaked across the cockpit canopy, though the droplets left rusty trails instead of clear water, and lightning flickered within dense smoke banks that never seemed entirely natural. Their pilot guided the craft through a winding descent between mountain ridges, scarred by generations of excavation, until towering refinery stacks emerged from the haze like colossal stone pillars. "Landing zone in 2 minutes," she reported, adjusting the controls with practiced precision. The valley below appeared abandoned except for a forgotten ore processing station whose collapsed roof concealed the entrance Corrin had identified from memory. If Imperial surveillance still overlooked the location, fortune had granted them a narrow opening. If not, the mission might end before anyone placed a boot on the ground. The shuttle settled onto broken duracrete with barely more sound than the wind already carried through the empty facility. The team disembarked quickly, unloading equipment before the pilot lifted away again to rendezvous with the vigilant Dawn in orbit. Silence returned almost immediately, interrupted only by the distant groan of machinery echoing across the valley, and the steady hiss of steam escaping fractured pipes. Corrin studied the surrounding cliffs, recognizing landmarks hidden beneath years of neglect. "The maintenance entrance should be below that conveyor structure," he said, pointing toward a rusted framework leaning at an uneasy angle.